Dregs, thanks so much for doing this. How are you, bud?
I'm doing okay, guys. Hey, look, I'm sitting here in the, what do we call it, the waiting room of the show. I think that's the green room, the waiting room. And I hear Rosie say, look, I'm tired of doing the negative. And I'm happy to hear that, to be fair, because the reason that I'm happy is not that it matters to me one way or another. I wake up, I sleep fine, whether the Toronto Maple Leafs win or lose. It doesn't matter to me. But I do think it's important to recognize that, okay, you're 20 games in. Should the Toronto Maple Leafs be a better team than they are right now? Without question. Areas of concern, too many to count. Too many to count. The fact that they've got a growing number of players who aren't playing because of injury and otherwise, yeah, that's another issue that's developing right before our very eyes. But I look across the National Hockey League here, fellas, and I see the Leafs aren't that far out of third in the Atlantic. Then I look across 32 teams, and there are 5 teams right now that are below 500. 5 out of 32. So it's pretty obvious you can't continue to lose. 5-game losing skid is embarrassing. It's got to stop. It has to stop. There's no way around that. But when I look at this team, aside from what appears to be some obvious areas of concern and need, I still think that you got to observe the fact that they're one win away from beating the Florida Panthers last year. And all the noise that's developing in this market wouldn't be here right now if they had done what they did a year ago, regardless of Marner and company. So we'll see how it pans out in the near future, but they've got to change it. Otherwise, the narrative is just going to get louder.
Yeah, and Dregs, I mean, doing what you do, is this just a bad stretch they can pull out of, or is there some serious concerns about the construction of this team that they're trying to rectify?
Well, maybe a little of both, to be fair. Yeah, they can pull out of it, but, one of two things is going to have to give here. Either the coaching staff, which is highly unlikely, is going to relent and say, okay, well, they don't want to play the North-South game. They don't want to check hard. They don't want to forecheck the way that, the Berube design structure of the team is built. They don't want to do that, or they're unwilling to do it. That's a bigger issue if that's the way it is, because as we know, I mean, look around the league. There aren't trades that matter this time of the year. And the Toronto Maple Leafs aren't loaded with good young developing talent on its way. Sure, you can look at Ben Danford in the Ontario League. You can look at Easton Cowan. But beyond that, there's not a lot that the Leafs can work with. So doesn't it feel like the answers have to be internally? I mean, it's hard to point fingers at guys who aren't in the lineup. But I remember having a conversation with someone really closely related to the Leafs who just prior to the start of the year said Austin Matthews is going to have to play a different role. He's going to have to be the guy that holds on to the puck more through the neutral zone and in the offensive zone. He's going to have to be more patient. He's going to have to shoot from different areas. He's going to have to be willing to go to the net and not just be the receiver on the power play or a guy that's waiting for that tap-in pass. And we know that he's capable. I mean, hell, this guy's an elite level talent. There's no doubt about that. But we haven't seen that type of adjustment in Matthews' game. And I think that that's kind of spread across and throughout the roster. The one consistent for me has been Johnny Tavares. Yeah, I mean, he just plays the way that he plays. Matthew Nyes plays the way that he plays. William Nylander drifts in and then he drifts out. Well, when you don't have Matthews available, you don't have Marner, obviously. That ship has sailed. You need the guys that you do have to play the way that they're capable of playing. Otherwise, you're not going to win. And that's where we're at 20 games in.
Yeah, it's been an up and down type turbulent start like that. But I think since we're on it, you talk about Matthews. Is there anything you can share on Carlo, like the injury concern? Seems like everybody's hurt right now. Yeah,
it does seem that way. The only thing that we're being told, aside from the obvious upper body, lower body, is that they're likely not going to be available this week. And I say that specific to Austin Matthews. I'm told he's feeling better, but probably not available for tomorrow or for Thursday. Can't be sure on Brandon Carlo. Seems unlikely. Again, placed on injured reserve. Now what? You look at Chris Tanev. Who else are we looking at here? Scott Lawton. These guys not available tomorrow. And I'm just looking at what I read before I joined the segment here, and it looks like Nick Roy is not in practice either. Is that right? So
correct.
All of a sudden, they called up Jacob Quillen from the American Hockey League. They claimed Troy Stetcher, interesting add to their defensive depth from the Edmonton Oilers, but no, it doesn't appear like there's a lot. Now I'm looking specifically at tomorrow's game against St. Louis. Maybe by Thursday, Matthews aside, the picture is different for Scotty Lawton and company, but it's not great right now on the injury front.
Yeah, and we were talking just before you got on Nick Robertson, like his work ethic, his production. He's been the shining piece of the Leafs in many ways right now through this terrible stretch. He's been on the trade block for what seems like a year and a half. Is that play softening their idea of maybe moving him, or is his stock only going up to maybe get something done? What are you hearing on that front?
Robertson?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my phone dinged, so the audio got cut off here. Yeah, it's a delicate one, but at least temporarily, and it feels like we have to gauge almost everything we talk about here with a time-sensitive stamp, because Nick Robertson had some flashes. He was elevated into the top 6 and onto the top line, and he responded. He generated some offense, and he's played some really, really good hockey for them. And as soon as that transformation happened, well, the message that you're getting from the Leafs is, see, that's why you don't give players away, because depth actually matters, not just in the playoffs, but in the regular season as well. But in saying that, we know that Nick Robertson, to your point, Rosie, has been on the block for a long period of time. No different than David Kampf was and other pieces of the Maple Leafs. But I'm okay with Treliving standing pat and saying, look, we might have to rely on these guys. And maybe the David Kampf scenario plays out differently if he reports to the Marlies. Maybe he gets called up and maybe he's still with the organization. Didn't pan out that way, and he gets plucked by the Vancouver Canucks, and he's got a fresh start. So Robertson has had some life injected into his time in Toronto and maybe a little bit into his game. But, he responded. He's got to continue to respond. Otherwise, maybe he finds himself back into their bottom 6 and maybe again in the press box. And if that happens, then guess what? That Pat Brisson, who represents Nicky Robertson, is going to be calling Brad Treliving and saying, hey, yeah, it worked for a bit, but it's not working anymore. So let's see if we can get something done. I think that there would be some type of market for Robertson trade-wise, but Toronto needs players. Toronto doesn't need a 3rd or a 4th round draft pick. That stuff, as you get closer to the trade deadline, sure, you start to stockpile. But Toronto needs players that can play. And right now they think that Nick Robertson is a player who can help them.
Definitely. And Tree's always looking to get proactive. What's your sense of the temperature behind the scenes? Are things percolating maybe on the trade front?
Well, always with Treliving, always, right? Every manager is on the phone constantly and they do their due diligence. The problem that I think Treliving has, aside from the obvious, which we've already talked about, is the fact that he doesn't want to deal away the futures. We know this. Not a lot there, to be fair. So what are you doing? And if you're holding on tight to guys like Nick Robertson, look a little bit deeper into your lineup and tell me who you're going to trade, unless you're getting fair value back in return. We're talking about player for player, money in, money out. And 100% that Treliving is looking for that. And I don't think that he's peddling or he's shopping any one player. I think he's open to conversation. But you know what, fellas? So is Ken Hughes in Montreal and Patrick Galvin with the Vancouver Canucks and every general manager, right? The problem is that we're still early in the regular season. I know that sounds dismissive, but that's true. And as I mentioned right off the top of the segment here, you look at every division in hockey right now, and everything is so tight. So aside from a couple of teams, Calgary being among them, and Calgary doesn't have a strong appetite to move any of their better players. So what are you left with? Well, you don't have a choice other than to be patient. And I think that that's where Brad Treliving is and where he has to be. But he's let it be known that when the time is right, if there's a player that teams want to talk about, then he's willing to listen, depending on obviously who that player is.
Mhm. And looking at where this team's at right now, surprising to many, I agree that I think this team's better than how they're playing. But if this continues and they keep trending in this direction and playing the way they are, what do you think the first domino is to fall?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I honestly, I wish I had an answer. I mean, that's ultimately what I do is provide
Mhm.
inside information. But you guys are probably thinking the same thing as I am. I woke up this morning to a text message and I was asked about, the speculation. I don't know. One of the papers mentioned about should Craig Berube be on a hot seat? Well, I mean, talk about low hanging fruit and clickbait, right? I mean, like seriously, what are we talking about here? I'm a big believer, and it doesn't matter if it's a player or if it's a coach. You measure the body of the work, and you have to look at what the Leafs came close to and didn't accomplish last year. Now, if 5 games turns into 15 games, different conversation. And it doesn't matter what I think. I happen to think that Craig Berube is a terrific coach. I do. And I'm not necessarily talking about coaching. The only reason I bring it up is because I saw it being referenced. And all it is engaging the fans who are going to pile on social media and tell you what they think. Well, that's not how organizations operate or run. That's just not it. But if you're not doing something like that, and your players aren't committed and they're not playing the way that your coach has asked them, from day one to play, well, then do you have a choice other than to go after what the core would be of the Maple Leafs? And then that gets tricky because you're talking about no trades and no move contracts, right? So for me, it's way too early for that, but I'm also not on the board of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. Not involved in ownership, not involved with senior management. And if 5 game skid, as I said, turns into a 10 game skid or higher, then Brad Treliving is he's going to have some interesting fires to deal with, I would think.
Yeah, all bets would be off in that case, and the pressure is
Yeah.
mounting. And I wanted to get to the Calgary conversation. I wanted to defend you a bit because I can't stand social media. None of us can. But like people were trying to correlate that you were trying to say Matthew Nyes would be up for discussion in a
No.
Rasmus
Yeah.
Andersson deal. You weren't saying that. We all know he's untouchable. But what can you tell us about the current state of the
Yeah.
Calgary Flames? Obviously, they'd be a pretty nice fit for the Maple Leafs trade wise. From
Yeah.
what I'm hearing, pushback wise, it just doesn't sound like the Leafs and the Flames right now can make a trade. Are you hearing that?
No, and look, I'm glad you bring it up because I do want to clarify things for our good buddy Jay Rosehill here as well. We share information publicly. That's what we do. And a shred of information or speculation turns into a wildfire, especially in a strong Canadian market. And that's what makes these markets great. So it is what it is. Do I think that Brad Treliving continually talks to Craig Conroy? Absolutely, he does. Does he talk to him about Rasmus Andersson? Absolutely. Would he have interest in Nazem Kadri potentially coming back? Of course he would. I mean, come on, like you just look at the quality of the player. But to your point, Nick, on me dismissing the whole idea, and the reason I brought up Matthew Nyes in the context that I did on the podcast that I did last week was, as I've illustrated here, Toronto doesn't have a deep pool of futures to work with, right? It's Easton Count, it's Ben Danford, it's a first round draft pick in 2028. That's really what we're talking about here, right? So if you're Craig Conroy and you're willing to have a trade conversation, and maybe it includes a contract extension for Rasmus Andersson, what do you think it's going to take? And if those futures aren't going to get it done, or Toronto doesn't want to part with those futures to get it done, if you're Craig Conroy, you're asking for Toronto's best. And among Toronto's best would be Matthew Nyes. It's not going to happen. Toronto would never consider trading him, and nor should they. But it just speaks to, the limitations with the contract protections that Treliving has to work with, and the fact that he went in all in last year. And I don't blame him for that. He gave up Fraser Minton in a first round draft pick for Brandon Carlo. Gave up Gerbenkin in a first round draft pick for Scott Lawton. They needed a center. They got that in Lawton. They needed a defenseman. They got that in Brandon Carlo. And if they win game 7 and go to the Eastern Conference final, we're not even having these conversations at this point. So Thank you for allowing me to clarify, because a little bit of information can go a long way, especially on social media when it's twisted 1,000 different ways.
It sure does. It sure does. Well, trades aside and all that, for this team to start playing the way that they're probably capable of, what do you think's the first thing that needs to happen? Is it both goalies healthy between the pipes? Is it the D getting their head screwed on straight? What do you think is the first thing that needs to happen to get things on track?
Yeah, but by D, I think overall structure of the defense. I just think that, the group's inability to commit to playing a harder game has put added pressure on the defense, and then by extension, more stress on the goaltending. I don't know if you want to date it back to Anthony Stolarz coming out and being very critical of his teammates early on, and the fact that his game started to sag after that. That's been a part of it. Getting Joseph Woll back, it adds some stability. There's opportunity now for Joe Woll. So I mean, goaltending has to be above average. It has to be, and if it is, then I think that does allow the defense to settle in. I mean, even Troy Stecher in the mix here, fellas. I mean, Troy Stecher has to be as hungry a player as there is in the league, right? He's bounced around a little bit. All Craig Berube needs him to be able to do is make a simple play and be competitive. If he does those two things, then he's probably going to be better than Philippe Myers right now, with all due respect. This kid's game has just gone south on him, and his confidence is lacking in all of that. So one area Rosie, you guys know this, one area, if your goaltending elevates and makes a timely save, all right, well, maybe that fires up just the overall philosophy of the group and commitment of the group. Because one thing we know, Chief isn't going to relent here. He's not going to relent. I mean, you either have the will to commit to playing the game that he needs you to play, or it's going to go bad. So something's going to crack here. But too often we see really good players look for the easy play rather than the play that is going to fit within their game plan and make it harder on the other team. But I do have time for the pushback on that, who say, all right, well, you play the North-South and you forecheck. Well, if everybody in the league knows that that's the game you're going to play, well, what does the opposition do? They make their adjustments so that they counter that, right? So it's a little bit more complicated than I'm stating it to be here, but they just need one of those things to click. Above average goaltending, the defense settles in, then maybe the rest of the group falls in line.
Make sure to check out more of our content right here on the Leafs Nation YouTube page. We got long form interviews, we got clips, we got epic rants by Jay Rosehill. We simply have it all. And don't forget, you can find out much more at theleafsnation.com. Thanks so much for watching.